There are things money can buy with ease: influence, silence, and the illusion of superiority. What it cannot purchase, not for any price, is the knowledge of who you truly are. This is the story of a woman who learned that lesson from her grandmother's kitchen table and used it to dismantle a man who had spent his entire life believing the opposite. Friday evenings at Maison d'Orval, a three-diamond establishment perched on the quieter end of Sherbrooke Street West in Montreal, moved with the precision of a Swiss watch and the pressure of a live wire. The dining room was all warm amber lighting, white tablecloths pressed to a razor's edge, and the muted clink of Riedel stemware carrying the scent of aged Bordeaux and seared duck confit. The kind of place where reservations were made 6 weeks in advance, and the wrong fork could end a career. For Tessa Okafor, a 29-year-old server who had been working double shifts at Maison d'Orval for the past 2 years, the restaurant was both a lifeline and a kind of beautiful prison. The money was good, genuinely good, better than anything she could have earned elsewhere without finishing the economics degree she had abandoned halfway through her 3rd year at McGill. She had left not because she had failed, but because her father's diagnosis had arrived like a stone, through a window, sudden and irreversible, and someone had to be home to manage the appointments. The paperwork, the gaps that disability benefits. Her professors had told her she was one of the sharpest students they had seen in years. Her father told her she didn't have to do it. She did it anyway, because that was the kind of person Tessa was. She had learned precision and composure at Maison d'Orval. She had learned to read a table in 30 seconds, who was celebrating, who was negotiating, who was performing wealth for someone they were trying to impress. She had learned to be invisible in the way that only truly competent people can be, present at exactly the right moment and absent at every other. The Friday in question began the way most Fridays did, with the front-of-house manager, a tightly wound man named Gilles Beauchamp, circling the reservation list. With a red pen and a look of controlled dread, he found Tessa near the service station at 6:15, straightening silverware with the mechanical calm she had cultivated over 2 years. "Table 7, Gilles said, his voice low. "Vachon, party. 4 guests. Tessa kept her expression even. Henri Vachon was a name she recognized. Most people who worked in Montreal's hospitality industry recognized it. He was the founder and chairman of Vachon Capital Group, one of the largest private equity firms in Quebec, a man whose face had appeared on the cover of L'Actualité twice in the past decade. He was also, by the collective testimony of every server who had ever had the misfortune of drawing his table, a man who treated service staff the way a child treats an anthill, with casual, methodical cruelty, largely for the entertainment of watching things scatter. "Understood," Tessa said. "He's bringing his son-in-law, Etienne Larocque. You know who that is?" She did. Etienne Larocque was the newly appointed CFO of Vachon Capital, Henri's daughter's husband, a man who had built his reputation on structured debt instruments and weekend skiing at Mont Tremblant. He appeared in the financial press frequently. He was 37 and had the look of someone who had been told he was exceptional so many times that the information had calcified into his bone structure. "And the other 2 guests?" Tessa asked. "His daughter, Isabelle, and a business associate, someone from overseas." Gilles paused. "I don't need any incidents." "There won't be," Tessa said. She believed that when she said it. The Vachon party arrived at 6:45, biasing the maître entirely, and moving toward table 7 with the unhurried confidence of people who had never once been told to wait. Henri Vachon was in his early 60s, silver-haired and broad-shouldered, wearing a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His daughter, Isabelle, was polished and quiet, the kind of beautiful that comes with enough money and enough discipline. Etienne moved beside her with his hands in his pockets, already scanning the room as though cataloguing assets. The fourth guest, the overseas associate, was a compact man in his 50s with watchful eyes and an expensive watch. He was introduced, in the brief murmur that passes for hospitality among the very wealthy, as Rolf. Tessa approached the table with the crisp efficiency she had spent 2 years perfecting. She welcomed them, offered still or sparkling water, recited the evening specials with the cadence of someone who genuinely understood the food. Henri Vachon did not look at her once. He took the menu from her hand, the way you might take a newspaper from a dispenser, mechanically, without acknowledgement. When she returned with the water, she noticed something. They had switched languages, not to English, which would have been unremarkable in Montreal, not to French, the language the table had opened with. They had slipped into something else entirely, a fluid, guttural, melodic tongue that Tessa placed immediately, and with a small, private jolt of recognition. They were speaking Alsatian. Alsatian is a Germanic dialect spoken in the Alsace region of northeastern France, a language that sits at the seam of French and German history and sounds like neither fully. It is spoken today by fewer than 500,000 people, most of them elderly, most of them in a narrow strip of land along the Rhine. It is not taught in schools. It is not used in business. It is the kind of language that dies quietly in old farmhouses and passes from grandparent to grandchild in the particular grammar of family intimacy. It was also the language Tessa's maternal grandmother, Genevieve, had come to Montreal from Strasbourg in 1971, Strasbourg, following a man who had not stayed but leaving behind a language that had. She had raised Tessa's mother in a small apartment in Rosemont, and when Tessa was born, she had insisted, firmly, consistently, with the patience of someone who understood that languages die only when people stop carrying them, on speaking Alsatian to her granddaughter every single day. For Tessa, it was the language of Sunday mornings, of her grandmother's kitchen, of bake-off slow cooking in the oven, and the radio playing something old and French. It was the language of being held. Hearing it come from Henri Vachon's mouth was an experience she could not immediately name. She kept her face entirely still. She poured the water with a steady hand and said nothing. What she heard was this. "The young one, is she listening?" Henri murmured in Alsatian, not bothering to lower his voice. "She's pouring water," Etienne replied in the same dialect, with the bored confidence of someone who had used this conversational shield many times before. "She understands nothing." Henri glanced at Tessa with the frank, assessing look of a man examining something inanimate. "Rough hands," he said, "working class all the way through. You can always tell." He picked up his menu. These places really ought to have more rigorous standards for the front of house. She looks like she drove in from Laval. Isabelle said nothing. She was looking at her phone. Rolf swirled his water glass and smiled faintly. The food had better justify the performance. "It will," Henri said in Alsatian. "I've been coming here for 8 years. The kitchen is excellent. The staff is, well, functional." Tessa retreated to the service station. The burning in her chest was a specific and familiar kind. Not quite humiliation, not quite anger. Something that sat between the two like a coal that had been glowing for a long time. She had heard worse. She had been invisible to worse men than Henri Vachon. What she had not done in 2 years at Maison Dorval was understand the exact words being used to diminish her. That made it different. She took a breath, thought of her grandmother, and went back to take their order. The first course passed without incident. Tessa moved with practiced fluency between the table and the kitchen, reading the rhythm of the meal, keeping glasses filled to the appropriate level, staying exactly as invisible as she had been trained to be. Henry Vachon ate his scallop tartare with the focused attention of a man who ate well so frequently that pleasure had become a professional exercise. When she returned to clear the first course plates, the conversation at table 7 had shifted. Henri was leaning toward Rolf, his elbows on the table, his voice carrying the particular intensity of a man who had switched from social performance to actual business. He was still speaking Alsatian. He was speaking quickly. Tessa moved with slow deliberateness, stacking plates with the careful silence she had perfected, and she listened. The Belmont Street properties, Henri was saying. All 14. We complete the acquisition by the end of next month. The tenants have already been given notice. Some of them are fighting it, Rolf said. Ass. Of course they are. Henri's tone carried a thin amusement. They have a community legal clinic helping them, some non-profit with no money and 2 articling students. We've already had our lawyers file 3 counter-applications. By the time anything reaches a hearing date, we'll have vacant possession and the demolition permits in hand. He took a sip of his Chablis. The permits, incidentally, were not difficult to arrange. Arrange, Rolf repeated carefully. Councillor Deschênes sits on the planning committee, Henri said. He's been a friend of the firm for several years. Certain contributions to his discretionary fund tend to clarify his thinking considerably. Tessa's hand stilled for just a fraction of a second on the edge of a plate. Etienne leaned in. The environmental assessment on the Belmont land. You're proceeding with the Mercier report? We're filing it. Yes, Gilles told me. The Mercier firm flagged soil contamination on the eastern parcel. Lead and hydrocarbons from the old dry cleaning operation. Gilles should learn to keep that between himself and the geologist. Henri said, without particular concern. The Mercier report that goes on file will reflect acceptable levels. The one that does not go on file will live in a drawer. By the time anyone thinks to test the soil independently, the foundation will have been poured for 18 months. There was a silence at the table. You're building residential on that site, Rolf said. High density, Henri confirmed, 460 units. Pre-sales open in March. The market in that corridor is extremely healthy. Tessa carried the plates back to the kitchen. Her pulse was doing something that was no longer in keeping with the professional calm she was supposed to maintain. She set the plates on the pass and stood for a moment with her back to the kitchen wall. She was not a lawyer. She did not know the precise statutes that governed municipal bribery in Quebec or the regulations around environmental disclosure in residential development. But she had spent 2.5 years studying economics at McGill before her father's illness had changed her plans, and she had a clear enough understanding of what she had just heard. Henry Vachon had described bribing a city councillor to obtain permits, suppressing an environmental report documenting soil contamination, and proceeding to sell residential units on land that his own consultant had flagged as unsafe. 460 units, families, children. She went back out to the dining room. The main course arrived, duck breast with a cherry reduction for Henri, a Dover sole for Isabelle, lamb for Etienne, the vegetarian tasting option for Rolf. Tessa served with the smooth efficiency that had kept her employed at Maison Dorval for 2 years. She said nothing. She smiled precisely. She vanished. At the table, the conversation had moved on to other things. A property deal in Vancouver, a mutual acquaintance who had apparently made a poor investment, Etienne's upcoming board presentation, light, social, in French again. Then Henri looked at his lamb and frowned. He lifted one hand and beckoned. Not toward the service station, not toward Tessa specifically, but in the general direction of the staff, the way you might summon a taxi. There's something wrong with this, he said when she reached the table. Tessa looked at the plate. The lamb was perfectly cooked, exactly as ordered. She had carried it from the pass herself. "I apologize, Mr. Vachon. What seems to be the issue? It's overcooked." He pushed the plate an inch toward her. "I asked for medium rare." "This is medium. I want it replaced, and I want to speak with the chef." Tessa looked at the lamb. She looked at the interior temperature that was visible in the single cut he had made. It was unambiguously medium rare. She had, in 2 years, never once sent an incorrectly prepared plate from the kitchen. She knew, with the quiet certainty of someone who had served this man's type many times, exactly what was happening. He had grown bored. He wanted an audience. He wanted to see someone scramble. "Of course," she said. "I'll take this back to the kitchen." She picked up the plate and walked deliberately back through the dining room. But she did not go to the kitchen. She went, instead, to Gilles Beauchamp's office, and she set the plate down on his desk. Gilles looked up from his scheduling spreadsheet with the expression of a man who senses disaster. "The lamb is perfectly prepared," Tessa said. "Mr. Vachon is claiming it's overcooked. It is not. He will ask you to comp the table, and he will ask you to reprimand me. I'm telling you before it happens." Gilles looked at the plate. He looked at the lamb. He looked at Tessa. "Tessa," he said carefully, "Vachon Capital Group has a corporate account with this restaurant. Their annual spend is—" "I know what it is," she said. "Then you understand that if Henri Vachon says the lamb is overcooked, I need to treat it as overcooked." Tessa studied the man behind the desk. Gilles Beauchamp was not a bad person. He was a person who had been shaped by a system that ran on the comfort of the wealthy and the compliance of the people who served them. And he had learned, over a long career, to protect himself by protecting the people who could afford to hurt him. She did not blame him. She had understood this about the industry from her second week. She had simply hoped that when the moment came he would find some small reserve of courage. "You're asking me to go back out there," she said. Gilles looked at the floor. "Take the rest of the evening. Come in Monday and we'll discuss your schedule going forward." He paused. "I'm sorry, Tessa. You're one of the best servers I have. But I can't." "I understand," she said. She left the office. She stood in the corridor between the kitchen and the dining room for approximately 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, she made a decision that she had, if she was being honest with herself, been building toward since the moment she heard her grandmother's language sliding off Henri Vachon's tongue. She untied her apron. She folded it once. She picked up her serving notepad, which she still had in her apron pocket, and she walked back into the dining room. Table 7 fell quiet as she approached. Henri Vachon was in the middle of a sentence directed at Etienne. He stopped when he registered Tessa's expression. Something in her bearing had shifted in a way that even a man accustomed to dismissing service staff could feel. "Mr. Vachon," Tessa said in English, loudly enough that the adjacent tables turned. "I've return your lamb to the kitchen. I want to make sure I've understood your preference correctly." Henry's eyes narrowed fractionally. "I told you, medium rare." Tessa set the plate back down in front of him. She looked at Etienne. She looked at Rolf. And then she looked at Henri Vachon, and she said, in Alsatian, in her grandmother's cadence, in the rounded, warm vowels of a woman who had grown up with this language threaded through her earliest memories, "The lamb is medium rare. We both know that. What I'd like to understand is whether the soil reports for the Belmont Street project are also filed according to your personal definition of accuracy." The silence that followed was total. Henri Vachon's face did not simply fall. It underwent a kind of structural collapse, the way a building looks in the seconds between the charge detonating and the walls coming down, a brief, suspended moment of disbelief before everything moves at once. The color left his skin. His jaw opened slightly and closed. Across from him, Etienne Larocque had gone completely still. his wineglass arrested halfway to his mouth. Rolf set down his fork with a small, deliberate click. Isabel looked up from her phone. Tessa continued in Alsatian, calmly, her voice carrying the composed quality of someone who had been waiting long time for the right moment. Councillor Deschames's discretionary fund, the offshore wire, the Mercier report that goes on file and the one that doesn't. 460 residential units on land your own geologist flagged for lead contamination. She paused. My grandmother came from Strasbourg in 1971. She spoke Alsatian to me every Sunday morning for the first 22 years of my life. I imagine she would find this conversation interesting. Who are you? Henri said. He sounded for the first time like an old man. My name is Tessa Okafor, she said, in English now, clearly, so that the tables on either side could hear. I've been your server this evening. And for the record, my hands are rough because I work, Mr. Vachon. I work 2 jobs to cover my father's dialysis treatments while you build condominiums on poisoned ground and call it a healthy market. She placed her folded apron on the edge of the table. The lamb, she added, is perfect. She turned and walked out of the dining room. Nobody moved, even the sommelier, who had been standing near the wine station and had heard everything, simply watched her go. Isabel Vachon looked at her father. Then she looked at Etienne. Her expression was not the one either man had expected. Page 460, she said quietly, in French. How many families? Nobody answered her. Outside, the October air on Sherbrooke Street had the particular sharpness of early Montreal autumn, cold enough to be honest, still carrying just enough warmth to remind you what had been there before. Tessa stood on the sidewalk, with her coat over one arm and her phone in her hand. The adrenaline in her system was a physical thing, a bright electric current running from her sternum to her fingertips. She did not go home. She sat in a cafe on Bishop Street with a coffee she barely touched, and she spent 90 minutes being very precise and very thorough. She was not, as she had told herself in the corridor, an impulsive person. She was a person who had studied enough economics to understand how financial crimes were structured, and enough current events to know that the CBC investigative unit had recently run a 3-part series on municipal corruption in Quebec's development sector. She was also a person who had spent 2 years memorizing details, table preferences, dietary restrictions, the names of wines and the nuances of sauces, and what she had heard at table 7 was no different. She had the name of the councillor. She had the nature of the payment, described explicitly as a contribution to a discretionary fund. She had the name of the development, the number of units, the specific contamination flagged by the geologist, the mechanism by which the accurate report would be suppressed. She had the name of Rolf, who was a foreign business associate present for a conversation about bribing a Canadian city official, which was its own category of problem. She drafted an email to a journalist named Delphine Chartrand, who covered municipal politics for the CBC and whose byline she had seen on the Development Corruption series. She was careful. She wrote what she had heard, and only what she had heard, and she noted that she had heard it because she had grown up speaking the language the conversation was conducted in, and that the speakers had operated under the assumption that she did not understand them. She sent the email at 9:43 in the evening. She also called the Quebec Ombudsman's office and left a detailed voicemail then. She called her father. "Hi, bébé," he said, answering on the second ring, his voice carrying the particular careful lightness he used when he was trying not to sound tired. "Hi, Papa. How are you feeling?" "Good, good. A little cold this evening. Your Auntie Renee brought soup." A pause. "You're done early? Everything okay?" Tessa looked out the window at the street. The last of the evening's restaurant-goers were moving past in their good coats, breathing small white clouds into the autumn air. "Yeah," she said, "I actually have something to tell you." What happened in the weeks that followed was not a single dramatic event, but a series of them, arriving like dominoes that had been standing for a long time waiting for someone to touch the first one. Delphine Chartrand called Tessa the following morning. She was careful, professional, and had clearly been awake since early with the email. She told Tessa that several elements of what she had described were consistent with a pattern of municipal approvals in the St. Henry and Pointe St. Charles corridors that her team had been investigating for nearly a year, without a specific enough thread to pull. The Belmont Street project and the name of Councillor Deschênes gave her that thread. She also told Tessa that what she was describing, if substantiated, was a story of significant public interest. The UPAC, the Unité Permanente Anti-Corruption, Quebec's Permanent Anti-Corruption Unit, received a formal complaint 11 days later, filed by two separate sources. One was anonymous, one was not. Tessa gave her statement in an office on René Lévesque Boulevard on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting across from two investigators who took very careful notes and asked very precise questions. She answered all of them. She told them exactly what she had heard, exactly when she had heard it, and exactly how she had understood it. She told them about her grandmother. One of the investigators, a woman in her 40s with reading glasses and a careful voice, had paused at that and looked up. "You grew up speaking Alsatian," she said. "Every Sunday," Tessa said, "my whole life." Councillor Deschênes resigned from the planning committee on a Thursday, 41 days after the evening at Maison d'Orval, citing personal reasons. The resignation was reported in La Presse and picked up by the CBC. It was the third paragraph of Delphine Chartrand's story that noted the timing. The fourth paragraph mentioned the UPAC's investigation. The Belmont Street development permit was suspended pending review. The environmental files, both of them, including the suppressed Mercier report, which turned out to exist on a server belonging to a junior associate at the consulting firm who had not been told to delete his copies, were entered into the review record. Henri Vachon did not immediately face charges. These things move slowly, especially when the lawyers are expensive, but the board of Vachon Capital Group held an emergency meeting, and Henri's role as active chairman was transitioned to an oversight capacity, which is a particular kind of corporate language for a particular kind of fall. His name appeared in print several times in ways it had not before. His photograph, which had graced the cover of L'Actualité, twice now appeared above sentences containing the words investigation and anti-corruption. Etienne Larocque retained his position, briefly, until Isabelle filed for separation in November. In the divorce proceedings, her lawyers identified several financial arrangements within the Vachon capital structure that had not been fully disclosed to Isabelle as a minority shareholder in a family trust. These arrangements became a secondary matter in the investigation. Isabelle had, it emerged, done her own research after the evening at Maison d'Orval. She had spoken to lawyers. She had spoken to Delphine Chartrand. She had, in quiet and methodical ways that her father had never anticipated from a daughter he had consistently underestimated, begun to pull threads of her own. As for Tessa, she did not receive a check for $2.4 million. Real life is rarely that symmetrical, and she would have been the first to tell you so. What she received 5 months after the evening on Sherbrooke Street was an envelope from McGill University. It contained a letter regarding a reinstatement application to the Faculty of Arts, Economics stream that she had submitted in October after a conversation with an admissions coordinator who had read about her case in the CBC coverage. The letter informed her that she had been accepted. Effective the following September, with a full bursary covering tuition and a living allowance drawn from a recently established fund for students who had interrupted their studies for family caregiving responsibilities. She read the letter at her father's kitchen table in the apartment in Rosemont, where she had grown up, while he was in the next room on the dialysis machine. She read it twice. Then she took a photograph of it and sent it to her mother's phone, which had been sitting on her grandmother's old bedside table for the past 3 years, because some habits are stronger than loss, and Tessa had never quite been able to stop sending her mother the good news. She sat for a while in the kitchen. Outside the window, the March light was doing its early tentative thing, still cold, still thin, but present in a way the January light had not been. The street below had the particular sound of a Montreal neighborhood shaking itself loose from winter, the drip of melt, the distant call of someone's kid, a streetcar somewhere further east. She thought about her grandmother sitting at this same table, decades earlier, stirring a pot of something slow and warm, singing something quietly in a language that had come from the other side of an ocean, and had survived, carried forward in the only way any language survives. Person to person, voice to voice, morning to morning. Genes, her Vive, had never told her the language was a weapon. She had taught it as a gift. It turned out, Tessa thought, that the best gifts are the ones that become whatever you need them to be. She folded the letter carefully and put it in her coat pocket. She had a shift at the cafe on Bernard in 45 minutes. She put on her coat. She went to work.